Good afternoon, colleagues and friends. It is absolutely our privilege and honor to have Professor Christine Chinkin here with us. Professor Chinkin is Emeritus Professor of International Law at the LSE and is also currently the Director of the Center for Women, Peace and Security at the LSE. We are delighted to have her talk to us today on a gendered analysis of aggression and international law. This event is a collaboration between the SG branch of International Law Association and the Center for International Law. In fact, this is our first ILA event for 2026, so please allow me to take the opportunity to wish everyone a happy 2026, and we look forward to your participation in many events that the ILA will be lining up this year. I would also like to take the opportunity to thank Wong Partnership for hosting this event. I very much look forward to this event, as I'm sure you are too. So without further ado, may I please pass the floor to Professor. Professor, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And also thank very much the Centre for International Law and the Singapore branch of the ILA. As you know, I am the executive chair of the ILA generally, so it's always great to meet branches and, of course, to look forward to the conference in 2 years' time that the Singapore branch is going to be hosting. So, yeah, great. So thank you all very much for inviting me. I ought to just say a couple of words first about the sort of origins of the paper I'm going to talk about. And I should say thank you all very much for coming. It's based upon a report that I wrote with a colleague for an American NGO called New Lines Institute. And it arose out of a conversation, completely unconnected, in fact, around the fact that gender has been very much incorporated into discussions around genocide, for example. At the moment, there's a major discussion, negotiation going on with respect to the Crimes Against Humanity Treaty and the inclusion of gender into that treaty. And the conversation turned, well, why is it not included in the context of aggression at all? So the result was that we wrote the report on gender and aggression. Now, back in 2017, an international scholar, very leading international scholar, considered, to quote, that aggression was hanging by a thread in the firmament of international offences, barely mentioned in any way. And today, 10 years later, the picture is very different, with allegations of aggression and aggressive behaviour being made very widely in the media by political statements, with different protagonists in conflict consistently accusing the other protagonist of aggression. So Armenia and Azerbaijan, for example, will each accuse each other of aggression. Israel will accuse Iran, its proxies, the Houthis, Hamas, Hezbollah, etc., of aggression. In turn, they accuse Israel of aggression. Lebanon and Syria, likewise, with respect to Israel. In March 2022, the General Assembly exceptionally deplored in the strongest terms the aggression by the Russian Federation against Ukraine in violation of Article 2.4 of the United Nations Charter. There's now a special tribunal set up to prosecute crimes of aggression in Ukraine, currently being carried out by the Council of Europe. And of course, at the beginning of this year, as you all know, in the context of Venezuela, in the Security Council debate arising out of that, various countries accused the United States of aggression. Meanwhile, of course, the United States denied any such aggression. So what is evident is that states collectively or unilaterally assert aggression as a political rather than as a legal incident of armed force. So that to quote Judge Schlegel back in the Nicaragua case in 1984, while the Security Council is invested by the Charter with the authority to determine the existence of an act of aggression, it does not act as a court. It may arrive at a determination of aggression, or, as more is often the case, fail to arrive at a determination of aggression for political, not legal reasons. But aggression is a recognised concept under international law, and it's a concept that's evolved along what I call a dual-track process, so that it is both an international wrongful act giving rise to state responsibility and an international crime giving rise to individual criminal responsibility. State responsibility and individual criminal responsibility are distinct and concurrent, so that giving rise to state responsibility does not excuse individuals and vice versa. And I think it's very important both to recognise aggression as an international legal concept and to recognise this dual-track identity of aggression. And I think in particular, because too often aggression is seen only as an international crime, essentially letting states off the hook, something states, of course, favour. But this dual-track aggression, dual-track identity, has meant that aggression has developed in a bifurcated, piecemeal fashion through different legal regimes, different instruments. So there's a lack of clarity and a lack of cohesion in the concept. And I think that makes it different from other international wrongful acts and crimes. So what I'm going to do, very briefly, is go through the chronology of the development of the concept of aggression as an international legal concept, and then talk about it through a gender lens, with some examples from recent conflicts. So, the law first. The prohibition of interstate aggression under international law has its origins essentially following World War I, when there was, on the one hand, attempts to prosecute Kaiser Wilhelm II for crime of aggression, while on the other hand, the League Covenant, which was then negotiated, required member states to respect and preserve as against external aggression the territorial integrity of all members of the League. So essentially it's a concept of an international wrongful act based on violation of the solidarity of member states of the international community. But then the greater advances were made following World War II. Crimes against peace were for the first time prosecuted by the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, defined as the planning, preparation, initiation or waging of a war of aggression or a war in violation of international treaties, agreements or assurances. So aggression as a crime against peace thus incorporates pre-conflict, planning and preparation, commencing the war, initiation, and acts pursuant during a war of aggression. It was also included in the International Tribunal for the Far East, but it was still a highly contested status under international law. And Judge Rowling, for example, at the Tokyo Tribunal, said that he thought that the lofty phrase crime against peace was in fact not at all clear under international law. The ambiguous Pact of Paris did not outlaw war in the sense that waging an illegal war did become criminal in an ordinary way. So some scepticism about the state of international law. Essentially, this scepticism was put to rest, hopefully, by the United Nations Charter. And aggression is spelled out in the Charter in 2 articles. Article 1, first of all, the purposes of the Charter, spells out the need for states to take, quote, effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace and for the suppression of aggression. Aggression is thus made integral to the so-called jus ad bellum, the international law regulating the use of force. So aggression, however, is not defined, and the actual prohibition of force in the Charter, in Article 2, subsection 4, is not in terms of aggression, but simply in terms of the prohibition of the use of force. So we already have a sort of mix between prohibition of use of force and suppression of aggression. But of course, not every use of force under international law is unlawful. Article 51 of the Charter allows individual or collective defence, self-defence, in response to an armed attack. Yet another use of language. So prohibition of the use of force, self-defense to an armed attack, and this general notion of aggression floating around in the background. Similarly, the Security Council may authorize military force pursuant to its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, following a determination under Article 39 of the Charter of, again the quote, the existence of any threat to the peace, breach of the peace, or act of aggression. So, two brief observations about the Charter framework. First, the Security Council has in general avoided making determinations under Article 39, and when it does make determinations under Article 39, it doesn't say whether it's deciding that there is a threat to the peace, breach of the peace, or act of aggression. Silent on the point, so it doesn't give any guidance. Second, in practice, the militarized hierarchy established by the creation of 5 permanent members with the power of the veto has inhibited the Council from making any determination that any particular action constitutes aggression. So the failure by the Council means that states and their allies denote forcible action by other states as either contrary to the UN Charter, Article 2.4, or as legal self-defense, depending upon their political standpoint. And we saw this very clearly in the debates arising out of Venezuelan action last week. So, since 1990, the Security Council has in fact only once determined there to have been aggressive acts, and in the particular case, it didn't authorize the use of force. So, given the failure of the Security Council to give any such guidance, it's been left to the General Assembly, the International Law Commission, and the International Court of Justice to develop the concept of aggression and the consequences that flow from its determination. Right, well, the General Assembly got into the Act quite quickly. It began work on defining aggression back in the 1940s, the early 1950s, both through the newly created International Law Commission and through special committees. Cold War politics, however, intervened, and it wasn't until 1974 that a resolution was adopted by consensus by the General Assembly with a definition of aggression. The definition adopted in 1974 builds upon international legal norms governing interstate relations, grounded in the Charter and the 1970 Declaration of Friendly Relations, recognised acts of aggression to be, quote, incompatible with the notion of friendly relations between states. Seems a fairly obvious statement, in fact. The General Assembly then defined aggression. Primarily, it said, because of the conditions created by the weapons of mass destruction, and also it recommended its definition as guidance to the Security Council. General Assembly cannot, of course, tell the Security Council precisely what it ought to be doing. So the preamble of the definition notes that aggression is the most serious and dangerous form of the illegal use of force. So it is clearly something at a high level of gravity. But then Article 1 states aggression to be the use of armed force by a state against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, political independence of another state, or any other manner inconsistent with the Charter of the United Nations, essentially reiterating Article 1 of the Charter. However, this expansive wording conceives of aggression as an act that fundamentally undercuts the core values of the international community: state sovereignty, international peace, humanity, and human rights. The GA then, following this very general statement of aggression, sets out a non-exhaustive list of acts that constitute aggression and that give rise to international state responsibility. It also, in Article 5, denotes a war of aggression as, again, a crime against international peace. Importantly, again, I think in light of what was said in Venezuela earlier this week, there can be no political, economic, military, or any other justification for aggression. No territorial acquisition or special advantage is to be gained from aggression or recognised as lawful. Its temporal extent is not determinative, as a single first use of force, bombing, invasion, military occupation, however temporary, can all constitute aggression. Okay, so that's the General Assembly. Then we get to further notions about aggression, developed in turn by the International Court of Justice and by the International Law Commission. So first, the International Court of Justice drew the distinction that's become very famous in the Barcelona Traction case between obligations of a state towards the international community as a whole and those arising vis-à-vis just one other state, noting that the former, obligations arising towards the international community as a whole, are the concern of all states, and in view of the importance of the rights involved, all states are held to have a legal interest in their protection. They are so-called obligations owed erga omnes. What was the first example the ICJ gave of such obligations in contemporary international law? Outlawing acts of aggression. And then the International Law Commission in the 1980s, working on state responsibility in general, struggled with what it saw as ordinary international wrongful acts and more serious wrongful acts that it termed international crimes of state, and again, aggression was the prime example. The concept both of obligations owed erga omnes and the concept of a crime of state both revert back to this idea of international solidarity, the idea that such wrongs harm the entire international community as a whole. But what really worries the International Law Commission is what is the appropriate response to such a crime of state. For surely, they said, it has to be something more than the commission of an ordinary international wrong. An ordinary international wrong gives rise to reparations. But what more can you do if it's an international crime of state? And eventually, the ILC, in fact, dropped the concept, and there is no article on crimes of state in the Articles of State Responsibility adopted by the General Assembly in 2001. But, and building on the work of the ICJ in the context of erga omnes and Barcelona Traction, and the ILC's own work on peremptory norms of international law, so-called jus cogens, the ILC did provide for, quote, a serious breach by a state of an obligation arising under a peremptory norm of international law. Such a norm, of course, being the prohibition of aggression. Since a peremptory norm impacts on the international community as a whole, there are consequences for third states. They must cooperate to bring an end through lawful means any serious breach. They must not recognise as lawful any situation created by a serious breach, nor render aid or assistance in maintaining that situation. And note, I think perhaps inadvertently, the ILC create another distinction. Can there be any breach of a peremptory norm of international law that is not serious? But somehow we now have a serious breach and presumably, therefore, a non-serious breach. And then 2 decades later, the ILC further elaborated on the legal consequences of jus cogens. In a non-exhaustive list of jus cogens, it put, first of all, the prohibition of aggression, and in terms of consequences of such a breach, they reiterated states' obligations essentially to put an end to the serious breach and non-recognition. Okay, so that's the International Wrongful Act with some sort of reference to international crime running through it. Turning more specifically to international criminal law, now international criminal law, as you all know, was very much developed from the 1990s onwards. In the jurisdiction of the 2 ad hoc tribunals created with respect to former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, aggression was not included at all. When it came to the negotiation of the Rome Statute for the International Criminal Court in 1998, aggression was included within the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court, subject to a definition to be subsequently agreed by states parties. This was achieved at the review conference in Kampala in 2010, when the resolution of the crime of aggression was adopted by consensus. So to quote again, for the first time in history, a legally binding document was adopted which defined 2 key aspects of the crime of aggression: individual and state conduct. So the two are uniquely linked in the Rome Statute by making individual criminal responsibility for aggression contingent on a breach by a state of the prohibition of aggression as part of the jus ad bellum. So the court must determine, the International Criminal Court, must determine that the state has committed aggression before adjudicating on individual criminal responsibility. The definition that is given is essentially the same as the General Assembly came up with in 1974, despite, however many years later, there wasn't much move on this. But I think 2 points are worth bringing out. First, the ICC definition adds a leadership principle. For criminal liability for the act of aggression, the act must be carried out by a person in a position effectively to exercise control or to direct the political or military action of a state. In other words, a political or military leader. It's a protection of the ordinary soldier against being tried for aggression. And secondly, in the general definition of aggression, it is now said that the act must be of such a character, gravity, and seriousness that it constitutes a manifest violation in Charter of the United Nations. What's a manifest violation? Okay, turn now to the issue of gender and aggression, having, I think, and I hope, both given the sort of indication of how it has emerged under international law, and also indicated that there are clearly a lot of questions relating to coherence and consistency with respect to the concept of aggression. But in the over 100 years of debates around definitions of aggression in international law, in the adopted definitions, there is no mention of gender. The consequence is that all forms of violence, and in particular interstate forms of violence, are assumed to be gender neutral. It's also conspicuously absent in any debates around armed violence, both historically and contemporaneously, in Ukraine, the occupied Palestinian territory, Yemen, Sudan, and elsewhere, except in the very limited context of conflict-related sexual and gender violence, primarily construed as committed against women and girls. In other words, it gets pushed into the conduct of conflict rather than into the illegality of conflict in the first place. So in the report, what we do is challenge this assumption and provide a number of examples of how gender frames or impacts upon the conduct, circumstances, and consequences of aggression. And I'll just pull out a few of those. But first, what's the point of this? Why carry out a gender analysis at all? Is there any value? You may well think there absolutely isn't. The idea of gender, of course, refers to the various social, political, and cultural contributions that attach to concepts of womanhood and manhood, being male or female, in different societies. Gender has no fixed content, but its potency depends upon the ensuing creation of binary oppositions and the establishment of hierarchies between those binary oppositions. So common features of these constructions are, first, that masculinity and femininity are defined in dualistic terms. Second, that the qualities or characteristics, traits that are deemed masculine are assigned greater value than those defined as feminine. And third, gender is integral to the creation and maintenance of power and authority, and how it intersects and interacts in complex ways with other axes of power, such as race, religion, disability, class, sexuality. But of course, gender is not, in fact, dualistic. Defining it as a gender binary is misleading. Gender is fluid, and recognizing the fluidity of gender also allows us to question other binaries that are founded upon these different concepts, opposing ideas, and binaries that permeate the international legal system: lawful force, unlawful force, combatant, civilian, international, domestic, war and peace, all highly fluid concepts, all of which prevail in the international legal discourse and all of which need to be unpacked. But gender analysis is not straightforward. In the context of armed conflict, one reason is that the language of gender is often deliberately resorted to by all parties for competing purposes. For instance, as propaganda to garner support while belittling and humiliating other parties, or to legitimate a use of force that might otherwise be viewed as aggression. Judge Hilary Charlesworth has noted how all parties to conflict resort to gender language to boost their legitimacy, to appear strong and resilient, clearly male attributes, and avoiding weak actions that can be construed as feminine. Commonalities that complicate the issue and the value of assigning blame. Aggressive use of gender language is thus used strategically, both before physical recourse to aggression and subsequently. Different narratives and images, both of women nationals and those of the enemy state, are projected and exploited for national purposes. Women as victims, women as mothers, women as breeders of the next generation, women as protectors of the national heritage. If we look at Ukraine, Putin's language reflects very clearly his own image as a strong, macho man, and all the photos you see of him, on horseback and swimming in rivers, all of these things, but very clearly also presiding over a patriarchal social system, engaging in gender-based rhetoric and imagery, questioning the masculinity of Ukraine's leaders and of Ukraine's military and political leadership. Therefore, both attempting to create support at home, while at the same time humiliating and belittling those in the targeted state, thereby also creating a climate conducive to conflict-related atrocities. Ukraine, in turn, has also used gender tropes to counter and to support its defence against Russian aggression. Male fighters are exhorted to protect the country. Protecting the family and community is associated with being a good man, and men who do not want to fight may be mocked and shamed for it. But this, of course, also entails restrictions on men's movement. Neither they nor trans women, for example, were allowed to leave the country, while women face displacement, often multiple times. But these gender stereotypes are being challenged through the context of the conflict. Women in particular are increasingly challenging the gender stereotypes, exercising their agency in multiple ways as community leaders and also increasingly directly in the field. What will be interesting is to see whether any changes in gender understandings continue in the aftermath of any conflict, of the conflict. All situations of conflict are, of course, context-specific, require contextual analysis. But aggression never eventuates in a political or social void. It is typically the manifestation of a gendered, militarized nationalism deliberately cultivated by the aggressor state and its leaders. Again, think Putin, think Trump, think Netanyahu. Aggression is dependent on the normalization of militarism and securitization within the social and political fabric of an aggressor state. Gender systems are core to and help establish militarized structures and institutions. For instance, through military service, privileging military and security personnel, embedding militarism within the framework and structure of the state, and to rationalize the irrational, namely collective violence, including the unlawful use of force that amounts to aggression. The logic of militarized, securitized nationalism is reliant on the construction of the other as an enemy who poses a direct threat, necessitating resources to be diverted to military expenditure to counter the threat, presenting this state as the male protector against the threats based upon factors such as class, race, ethnicity, etc. But these are not just the preserve of belligerent states. They cut across all states. This, I think, translates into the double standards exhibited by states in the West in condemning Russian aggression in Ukraine, while tolerating Israel's gendered violence in the occupied Palestinian territory. The depiction and acceptance of democratic Israel, in contrast to primitive, barbaric Hamas, and hence of all Palestinians, is bolstered by representations of women in the two societies. Women's supposed inferior status under Islam and the curtailment of women's rights through such practices as dress codes, killings in the name of male honor, can and are contrasted with Israeli women's participation in public spaces, including the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF. Such depiction obscures the realities and complexities of, on the one hand, Palestinians' women's lives, including their active resistance to the occupation, and that of Israeli women, who also experience discrimination, sexual and domestic violence, harassment in different spaces, including within the IDF itself. In both Ukraine and Palestine, gendered tropes saturate depiction and justification of the respective protagonists in conflict. For example, from at least 2010, Russia has asserted its determination to uphold what it terms traditional family values, rejecting gender equality, gender diversity, and homosexuality. Its war against Ukraine is the manifestation of this objective being explicitly fought for the so-called traditional values, the meaning of gender, sexuality, womanhood, and manhood, and the natural place for men and for women. The war is not only implicitly gendered, but gender becomes a central point of explicit contestation. Russia's claim to be providing an alternative to the decaying morals of the West is a recurring rhetoric to justify its use of force, and Ukraine is seen as a key litmus test for the success of Russian project of alternative modernity against the decaying West. Gender has also been resorted to by Putin as a further justification for the aggression in Ukraine, depicting women in eastern Ukraine as victims in need of protection by heroic Russia. This, of course, is precedent in similar presentation by the United States of women in Afghanistan in 2001 as needing protection against the Taliban. Protecting Afghan women as helpless victims of Taliban oppression, the US and its coalition partners cast themselves as heroic masculine warriors. The expediency of this stance was exposed by the failure of the United States and its allies to take account of the dangers facing Afghan women when it withdrew its forces in 2021, facilitating the Taliban to take power. Netanyahu has highlighted the sexual violence committed by Hamas during the 7th of October attacks, also to bolster support for and delegitimate criticism of violence in Gaza. All gender-based violence, whoever it's committed by, must be condemned. But these examples show how women's rights are instrumentalized and weaponized to justify state violence, to legitimate military action that always translates into violence against other women while disregarding the interests and histories of those they are purporting to protect. The General Assembly definition of aggression, repeated in the Rome Statute, privileges spectacular manifestations of violence, language such as invasion, attack, bombardment, use of weapons, etc. And consequently, in the absence of spectacular violence, aggression may not be recognized as such. And in this sense, aggressive acts are always just gestures that seek to impose and or cement a hierarchical relationship of domination and subjugation over the enemy, the other, by means of violence. So although international law introduces a threshold over which such violence must cross before it is recognized as aggression, this does not mean that the forceful conduct of the aggressor state must continue to be maintained at that threshold. Aggression should be understood as a continuing act for as long as the aggressor state is able to maintain that dominant position over the enemy by virtue of its ability to deploy armed violence at the time of its choosing. And this, I think, applies particularly to the concept of military occupation. And we draw in the report an analogy that we think is useful that might be drawn between ongoing gendered violence and abuse in occupied territory for example, of those of non-Russian ethnicity living under Russian military power and those in the occupied Palestinian territories, and long-term domestic violence. In both scenarios, the oppressor controls all aspects of the lives that they dominate, including movement, contacts, spending, even what they eat, isolating them from allies and friends, dehumanizing and rejecting all opportunities for a consensual or inclusive future. The gendered hierarchical relationship of power and control is maintained through the perpetrator's impunity and ability, acted upon or not, to inflict significant arbitrary violence. So the violence of prolonged occupation, on occasion, erupts into extreme, spectacular violence, at which point, of course, the international community's attention is attracted. This is obviously the case following the Hamas attacks on the 7th of October 2023. The violence that is then carried out, however, is not perceived as aggression, with attention shifting to the use in bello, international humanitarian law, the actions carried out during the conflict, rather than the initial concept of aggression. This stance, I think, obscures reality, that it is the ability of the oppressor to inflict arbitrary violence when it chooses that is core to occupation as aggression. The everyday gendered violence in occupation or within a family is a reminder of the hierarchical relationships of power. An occupation, like colonialism, reflects a nexus between public and private violence in national systems. The latter, private violence, is tolerated as upholding the patriarchal structures of power. Similarly, the occupying power largely enjoys the continued benefits of de jure and de facto membership within the international community, a status denied to the occupied, for example, those in the occupied Palestinian territories, again redolent of patriarchal state histories that resist women's de jure and de facto equality with men. Aggression creates conditions in which constructed discriminatory divisions, primarily nationality, are heightened. This makes more likely the commission of serious international crimes along those same axes. Atrocity crimes manifest in different forms of violence perpetrated against different categories of people along pre-existing vectors of oppression and discrimination, gender, race, class, etc. By illuminating how gender shapes norms and activities and belief systems and intersects with other axes to place different groups at greater risk of forms of violence and armed conflict, gender analysis provides important insights into why, how, and the form of mass atrocities. For example, the gendered assumption that males of a fighting age are weapon bearers and thus pose a threat makes all men and more boys vulnerable to being targeted and killed in armed conflict. Srebrenica is a very obvious example. Men and boys are also more likely to be detained and tortured, as is the case in both the OPT and Ukraine. The targeting of men and boys has cascading gendered effects on women and girls, making the latter vulnerable to other forms of gendered atrocities. The widespread incidence of sexual and gender-based violence against civilians is a tactic and strategy of war to humiliate and terrorize the civilian population is another aspect of gendered aggression. Sexual violence is used against men and boys in Ukraine and the occupied Palestinian territory to humiliate, defeminize, to destroy their social position as protectors of their territory and their families, and thus their masculinity. And violence that targets reproductive health, attacks on maternity clinics, denial of food that means that women cannot feed their babies, women having to give birth in unsanitary situations with no medical attention whatsoever, all in different ways, again, are aspects of how gender permeates aggression. Now, I'm sure you can think of lots of other examples, or you may think that these are completely not worth considering. I'd just like to make a few, again, concluding remarks. First, aggression as a serious breach of international law incurs legal obligations for both the aggressor state and for third states. The aggressor state is required to cease its unlawful conduct, give assurance and guarantees of non-repetition. Territory occupied as a result of aggression must be reversed. The aggressor state must make full reparation. And under human rights law, there is now a concept of transformative reparation, not simply punitive reparation, which requires addressing the root causes of aggression, including the gender systems that help to normalise nationalism and militarism, fostering the toxic environment within which aggression becomes a rational pursuit. There are also third state obligations, as I've already mentioned, including the positive duty to cooperate to bring aggression to an end through lawful means, not to recognise any situation resulting from aggression, not to render aid or assistance in maintaining an act of aggression. I would emphasise again, as I think most states in the world are busy ignoring this fact, that this is a matter of legal obligation, not simply an ethical obligation that they should be responding to. But finally, maybe it's worth just thinking for a moment about preventing aggression. In the report, we argue that preventing aggression is not as complex or as challenging as states would have us believe. It's the preparation for and waging of war that are demanding and resource intensive. They require the creation and coordination of militarised structures and institutions, public and private, the normalisation of militarism and securitisation in political, economic, social and cultural life. Gender systems knit these processes together and have been used throughout history by those holding political and military power to naturalise the preparation for war, to justify resort to armed force and normalise social militarisation through many largely unchallenged assumptions. Assumptions such as armed force as the ultimate resolver of interstate disagreement. Resort to collective violence is rational. Possession and use of weapons are necessary for guaranteeing security and peace. That in war, those who are feminine need armed protection. Any man who refuses to engage in armed violent action is a traitor and jeopardising his own status as a masculine man. And accordingly, rather than commit to non-violence, states and ruling elites repeatedly resort to the threat and use of armed force as an appropriate response to interstate differences, and increasingly to domestic dissent that calls for non-violence. Now, we're not naive. We obviously know that dismantling the gender systems that rationalise violence will not prevent aggression. But we do believe that preventing aggression cannot succeed without dismantling the gender norms and belief systems that have been internalised, normalised and sustained by the systems of power, such as race and nationalism, that enable states to rationalise violence and war. Common to aggression and mass atrocities are supremacist ideologies and belief systems that subjugate and make reasonable the killing of other socially constructed groups based typically on their nationality, race, ethnicity. Such ideologies are not eradicated through recourse to force. The existence of standing armies has done little to deter an aggressor or prevent mass atrocities. Rather, they provide the material means by which aggressor states are able to actualise their ambitions. So we caution against the assertion that aggression is the most serious and dangerous form of the illegal use of force. That acts of aggression are regarded as a particularly pernicious form of unlawful force reinforces the binary distinction between lawful and unlawful uses of force, therefore legitimating lawful uses of force to erase the harm, suffering and destruction of warfare that always adversely and disproportionately impacts certain groups of persons defined by their identity. Moreover, the fact that resort to force is lawful in some circumstances helps to rationalise the very act of collective violence and to normalise the creation and maintenance of armed forces, making the design, production, accumulation and use of weapons logical and to be pursued as new technologies evolve, thereby fueling more new and ever more deadly arms races. And international law, I'm afraid, does little to disrupt any of these assumptions. The UN Charter may, on the one hand, prohibit the use of force, but it concurrently adopts and consolidates a militarised logic that paradoxically provides the basis for aggression, rather than committing unconditionally to non-violence to resolve disputes. And rather than address the root causes of disputes, that are frequently based on inequality, oppression, and injustice, states maintain and fuel inter- and intrastate inequalities. Illegality aside, aggression is the ultimate embodiment of masculinized authority and a violent gesture that seeks to escalate by demonstrating the failure on the part of the victim state to protect its victims. Okay, I'll finish there.